Good morning or good day. My name is Dave Scott, and today we're going to be doing something slightly different than a travelogue. On Monday, May 25th, our nation will celebrate Memorial Day. For some, it signifies the start of the summer season. But for many of us, it is a time to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice in war. Memorial Day was once called Decoration Day. It originally honored only those who lost their lives while fighting in the Civil War. During World War I, the United States found itself embroiled in another major conflict, and the holiday evolved to be called Memorial Day. Memorial Day commemorates the American military personnel who have died in all wars, including World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and the wars in the Middle East. Sometimes there is confusion between Memorial Day and Veterans Day. Veterans Day, which occurs in November, is a celebration of all who have served in our military forces. Memorial Day is one of remembrance of those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Most individuals who we raise up on Memorial Day died focused on winning a battle or ultimately the war. While that might have been their objective, their sacrifices resulted in something greater. It resulted in others being able to live in freedom and peace. In respect of their sacrifice, today I am going to use a portion of the presentation I gave at last year's Veterans Day celebration. It's appropriate because it focuses on peace. Peace being the objective, not war. Reflecting on my career in the United States Navy and an agency of the Department of Defense, my perspective on working as hard for peace as we did preparing for military action was not as strong as it was in the latter part of my career. During the Cold War, I was in the United States Navy, and like most junior military personnel, I was gung-ho. I was part of an aviation squadron whose job was to locate Russian missile-launching submarines, and if war broke out, sink them. After the Navy, I was a civilian for 40 years in an agency whose primary responsibility was to provide national security decision makers insights to protect our nation and our allies and keep the peace. I have to admit, it wasn't until later in my career when I attended the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and obtained a master's degree in national security decision making, that I fully realized that engaging in an act of violence we call war was not the only way forward. Not the only way to obtain peace. At the Naval War College, I was the token civilian, you could say, who studied for a year with a diverse group of 125 military officers from all 5 service branches and senior military officers from 33 countries. We studied how to achieve peace. Engaging in conflict is easy. Peace is hard work. This quotation is engraved over the main entrance to the Naval War College, and a copy of it hangs in our house here at CLV. I could not have served my country for 44 years without being committed to constructing the defenses of peace. If there was anything to be added to this saying, I would add, make it happen. And that's what many people in the United States military do today, is make peace happen. At the War College, we studied why nations go to war. War is not just the winning of battles like the ones I watched as a child on shows like Victory at Sea. As General Clausewitz, the famous Polish general and father of modern warfare, said in his book, war is the continuation of politics by other means. Let me repeat that. War is the continuation of politics by other means. It is the focusing of violence on others in order to make them do your will. War is not a senseless act of passion. It is controlled by achieving a political objective. Thus, the question one always needs to ask, can a political objective be achieved through nonviolent means? Please do not write me off as Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, prior to World War II, who sought peace at any cost. I am more of a Theodore Roosevelt foreign policy person. Walk softly, but carry a big stick. There are times when it is necessary to use military force, but it always should never be the first option, or maybe the second option, or the third option. When I studied wars throughout history, most were fought over a political or economic issue which war did not resolve. Many times this led to other wars. While the reason nation states go to war cannot always be resolved by peaceful means, it was very surprising as we looked at these wars that many could have been. Peace can be achieved by listening to other nation states' agreement and finding ways to build trust. Unfortunately, in the world today, we have many leaders who know how to talk, but very few know how to listen. At the Naval War College, we engaged in 48 weeks of small group discussions, and they were intense discussions on topics of war, economics, religion, political systems, and cultural differences. At the beginning of the year, we all stuck by our biases, but by the end of the year, we all thought differently. I want to share with you an example of how 4 officers changed. When we convened in early August, there were 4 officers who were very bitter and would not engage in discussions. They had valid reasons for not doing so. One officer was from Israel and the other from Egypt. They were both senior officers in their respective air forces. They had literally fought each other in the Six-Day War, and each had killed members of the opposite military. There was also an Argentinian naval officer. The Argentinian was second in command of the General Belgrano, an Argentine Navy light cruiser who during the Falkland Wars between Argentina and the United Kingdom. Another officer was a United Kingdom naval officer. The Belgrano was sunk by torpedoes launched by the British submarine HMS Conqueror. The United Kingdom officer was the commanding officer of the submarine. The sinking of the Belgrano accounted for over half the Argentinian deaths during the Falkland Wars. Needless to say, it took a long while for each of these officers to talk to each other. But gradually and eventually they did engage in dialogue. I won't deny that there were some very heated exchanges and discussions. At the end of the year, a group of students put on a show to raise funds for a charity. The 4 officers participated in the last act, and they brought the house to its feet. At the beginning of the year, they hated each other. But at the end of their act, they put their arms around each other in a long-lasting group hug. It brought the house to tears. It may not have changed respective national politics, but what they learned about working towards peace was a start. That moment is engraved in my memory, and it demonstrated to me conflicts can be avoided if nations and individuals act in active listening, not just talking, listening. Listening for common ground, and when none is found, keep trying. Sometimes it takes a long time, but it can happen if you leave your biases at the door. You will find a peaceful solution. Is there a formula for resolving differences? Absolutely not. You just have to keep searching for common ground. Trust. Absolutely essential if you intend to find a peaceful solution. Peace is not achieved by belittling other nations or its leaders. It is achieved by finding ways to diffuse misunderstandings and perceived injustices. Learning how to build trust between nations is what we did at the War College. And it's what we did at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization when I worked there. We did it every day. I'd like to explain how NATO works for peace. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or as the French call it, OTAN, I had the privilege of being a member of the U.S. military delegation to NATO. You might think there's a whole bunch of U.S. military at NATO headquarters in Brussels, but it consists of 14 senior officers of all the military branches, token Dave Scott civilian, and a 4-star admiral. As a group, we reported directly to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At that time, it was General Powell, and later in my tour, it was General Kashvili. Today, I want to share with you the importance of NATO as a place where keeping the peace is the biggest and number one priority. NATO began in 1949 with 12 nation-state members. It has grown significantly since then. Today, NATO is comprised of 29 different countries with different histories, cultures, languages. But they comprise one body, and that body is called NATO. This is a list of all the member nations. A whole lot. And you have to think that when at NATO, the rule is that every one of those countries has to say yes to a proposal. If one of them, if Iceland was to say no, the proposal is defeated. I was taught early in my career that it is impossible to get an agreement if a committee is comprised of more than 6 members. Getting 29 nations to agree unanimously on anything is a challenge. But it takes a lot of hard work, and it happens. And it happens more frequently than you would think. And the final agreement is usually one that is excellent. And it's always with how can we achieve peace through this legislation. Many Americans think about NATO from a war-fighting organization. But as Paul Harvey used to say, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. NATO is the best peace organization ever created. Think about history. When in history has there been a period of about 75 years where European nations have not engaged in some sort of conflict with each other? If you study European history, it has always almost been non-stop fighting somewhere on the continent of Europe prior to the establishment of NATO. The bedrock of NATO's existence has been that if one nation is attacked, another nation will come to its aid. This is enshrined in a treaty signed by all member nations. The knowledge that if you are attacked, or you're the attackee, that 29 nations will join together against you, causes other nations to think twice. Have NATO nations fulfilled the treaty obligation? Yes, once. When the United States was attacked on 9/11, NATO forces went with us to Afghanistan. But for most of NATO's existence, its work day to day is to resolve issues between nation-state members and non-members of NATO. Has that worked? During my 7 years at NATO, I was a witness on 3 occasions to a situation where member nations came close to engaging in military action against each other. It took a great deal of patience and effort to get the 2 nations who were prepared to go to war over perceived wrongs of the other nation to see armed conflict was not in the interest of either nation. Each time, one factor weighed heavily on the 2 nations, and that was the active participation of all the other member nations in trying to find common ground and peace and resolvement of the disputes. Those nations, with the United States taking the lead, made sure the 2 nations understood the political and economic consequences of not finding a peaceful solution. the weight in each instance of those consequences caused the aggrieved nations to find a peaceful solution. Mission. We'll talk about what NATO does, how it works towards peace. We've already talked about the fact that we're there to defend each country's by, if one is attacked, we'll defend the others. And so we are there to create a viable defense structure amongst all of the nations. Defense, not active going forward. Defense. On the military side, I talked about the treaty and one nation being attacked. But what I did not talk about is NATO will undertake military action based solely on a UN mandate, and it is only done it once. In the 90s, you may remember Bosnia, former Balkan area. It was terrifying to be in Europe at that time and see the killings that were going on in the Balkans. NATO said they're not members. We're not going there. But the UN continued to put pressure on us, and the moral argument won. And NATO did go in, not only with NATO members, but 22 other nations that worked with NATO to separate the warring factions. It's the only time that NATO has done something outside of the NATO countries. Promote democratic values in consultation. Well, that sounds a little bit Pollyanna, but it's not. After the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall in 1989, a number of states that were under Soviet control wanted to join NATO immediately. And as a matter of fact, in the ensuing years, a number of them have. But we made the correct decision that would not work. We needed to do a lot of work with each of the member nations prior to considering them for membership. As a consequence, NATO spent a lot of time and money working with those nations to build democratic governments and the rule of law. This also involved restructuring their militaries so that they were under civilian control, elected civilian control. It also meant educating citizens of nations to their responsibility as members of a democratic state. Again, this was building trust, educating and creating a whole package in which peace can be achieved. But on a day-to-day basis, what does NATO do? Besides defending nations and promoting peace, it does a lot of things. Domestic terrorism. Carol and I have lived in Europe for many years, and I've traveled there for many years. And I can attest that domestic terrorism is alive in Europe. On 4 occasions, I've been close to where bombs went off. There are some who are concerned about domestic terrorism coming to the United States. That may be true. But I'm going to tell you what NATO does. And it does it only if a nation state, i.e. a country, asks in writing NATO to work with them on terrorism and issues. When it does, NATO engages law enforcement and intelligence agencies of the requesting nation and helps them to predict and prevent terrorist activities. Trust me, it is not an easy task. You don't receive praise for the ones you prevent, but trust me, you get criticism for the ones you don't. Today, we don't think so much about weapons of mass destruction, but NATO does, and I do. Weapons of mass destruction, as in the military, we call them the ABCs: atomic, biological, and chemical warfare. With more and more countries wanting these weapons of mass destruction, preventing them from obtaining them is a critical task. A task that has been successful because when dealing with a country over their desire for weapons of mass destruction, and they're dealing with NATO, they know they are dealing with 29 other countries, and that is significant. I do have a concern. Bluntly, if the United States were to ever leave NATO, we would relinquish a leadership role. And as such, I fear that there will be proliferation of weapons of mass destruction should the United States leave. Too many countries make conventional arms, and they sell them to groups or nations that use them for non-peaceful reasons. Several of the countries who sell arms, I'm sad to say, are members of NATO, and that includes the United States. While NATO cannot tell a sovereign nation what it can and cannot sell, it can act and does act as a moral voice, telling a nation why a particular sale might not be a good idea in the name of peace. Energy security. Everything from pipelines to maritime security. The world depends upon shipping and maritime security. It is no longer where one country, even as large as ours, can address piracy, energy security, and maritime security. It is a problem that is best addressed by multiple nations. We'll talk a bit in a minute how NATO has deployed multinational forces to address these problems. Civil emergency planning. Whether you believe in global warming or not, it is a fact the oceans are rising, and we are getting increasingly more violent changes in weather and storms. Some nations, like the Netherlands, have worked very hard at dealing with global warming. And they have taken the lead in helping other NATO nations reduce the damage from national disasters. Locally, both New York State and New Jersey have called upon the Dutch to help them prepare defenses against rising sea level. Human trafficking. Many women have been tricked into prostitution, particularly in Europe, and particularly from nation states that were previously under Soviet control. While NATO hasn't solved this problem totally, it has taken an important step. Within the U.S. military, there is a code of uniform military justice. All of the countries have a similar code. NATO decreed that all 29 nations shall have a clause in their code that states that if a member of their military engages with a prostitute, they will be charged under that code. If you look across Europe today, everybody is recognizing the rising seas. But there are other environmental issues like air pollution, chemical pollution, and so on. The NATO nations, particularly in Europe, are working very, very hard to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. You've seen that in some of my previous presentations. But NATO as an entity itself is working hard to reduce the impact of fossil fuels at their various facilities, and particularly in training exercises. Cyber. The world is already engaged in cyber warfare. Some people say, well, that just is affecting computers. But computers are engaged in everything in our economy and the world's economy. Attacks or cyber warfare can cause deaths, just as guns can cause deaths. We need to address cyber from an international or world perspective. We tend to think that all technical solutions here in the United States come from Silicon Valley, an area located just the south of San Francisco. I have worked with folks in Silicon Valley extensively in my career, but I can tell you they are not the only place of technical solutions. Europe has outstanding technical capabilities, and NATO is using those capabilities. It's an example of working together, taking the best solutions from each nation and applying them. Let me give you an example that you might be able to relate to of a technical solution. It's not a NATO example. It's an example of weather forecasting models. The United States and the Europeans both have a model. Which one predicts weather better? If you turn on your TV today and we're looking at storms coming and the predictions or the modeling of those storms, you'll find that most forecasters are relying on the European model. It is more precise, it is more accurate than the US model. And so, even commercially, folks have seen we don't always have the best solution. A lot of times we do. Most times we do. But sometimes others have good technical solutions. And so we need to work with Europe and other nations on addressing the cyber issue. Probably saying, wow, I can't even read this slide. This slide is a little dated, but I want to use it because I want to convey some considerations. There is a blue box, and that is supposed to convey the nation states of NATO as it exists. If you were to count them up, you would not see 29 nations in there. That's because a number of nations that are in black over to the right have now joined NATO. But the slide is still useful to convey a point. Outside of the blue square or rectangle is a red box. And up in the left-hand corner, it has PFP, stands for Partnership for Peace. This was part of that education process prior to NATO nations joining NATO. But it was also these nations plus NATO that went into Bosnia. There was another nation just below the black ones that went in with us to Russia. And I had an unusual responsibility of providing them encryption equipment so that they could work with NATO. Russia itself has never expressed an interest in joining NATO. As a matter of fact, they're very critical of NATO. But all these nations in black join with the NATO nations and Russia by having offices on the campuses of NATO in Brussels. They sit in on all unclassified meetings. But not only them, if you look to the left, and there's a green box, and it's called NATO's Military Dialogue. Those nations are also in Brussels, or have representatives at NATO in Brussels. It is important to the security of the world, the United States included, that we have a dialogue with those countries and they understand their needs and interests. I've got to go back to Russia for a minute. It always frustrates me that Russia sits in on other meetings. Yet they say, we do not know what's going on at NATO when they talk in public. No, I'm not going to put you to sleep discussing each of these blocks about the structure of NATO. This slide has one purpose and one purpose only, to emphasize that NATO headquarters is a primarily civilian diplomatic structure. Yes, that jagged line is where the military, but that's mostly away from Brussels at places around the world. I mentioned there were 14 officers, civilian, and a 4-star. That was the total U.S. representation from the military at NATO headquarters. These other groups, the United States, primarily from the State Department, had 222 representatives that sat in committees. It is a civilian organization, not a military organization. But let's talk about how it works. How does it work on a daily basis? The picture to the left is the entrance to NATO, and that's where I used to go in every day. The work is done by, as shown in the picture on the right, by various committees. I chaired one committee and represented the United States on two others. But let me tell you, those 14 folks in the military delegation, we worked offline on everybody else's committees. We were a very disciplined team that was driven to assisting each other. And that included the 4-star rolling up his sleeves and working next to us to address issues in the various committees. I point out that the seats behind the oval where all these fellows in black suits were seated are where the non-members sit. There are 7 meeting rooms. When a national representative is recognized by the chairperson, a red light goes on at your microphone. I need to emphasize what I'm about to say. Everything you say is recorded. English is simultaneously translated into French and vice versa. The windows to the right in that picture are where the translators are. I must say, everybody around the table understands English, but many of them wait for the French translation. The tape recorder is why very little negotiation occurs at the table. We talk about summits. Summits are things where the heads of nations sit around a table similar to this. Very little discussion occurs. It's all been done offline. It's just the national leaders are agreeing to what was created by us offline. Negotiation at NATO occurs outside the meeting room. There are lounge areas situated throughout the building purposely for discussions. And yes, sometimes those discussions go into the cafeteria and even the bar. Why is that the situation? With 28 other diverse nations, you need to build strong coalitions on issues outside the meeting room before speaking on the record. You need to have those coalitions if you were to successfully achieve getting all nations to agree. But was I sitting there just spinning things for the United States? No. As a representative, you are required to voice coordinated positions of your nation. This is called guidance. For me, guidance was obtained in the following manner. 6 weeks ahead of a meeting, I had to draft and submit a U.S. position paper on each issue to be addressed by the meeting. My rule number 1 was never submit hard positions. Always leave room for negotiations. The draft was submitted to the State Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They in turn sent it out to coordination for 27 government entities for each of them to comment. Luckily, I didn't have the job of resolving conflicting input. The State Department and the Joint Military Staff, they resolved those and provided final guidance to me. As I say, the guidance gave me some wiggle room, but I couldn't go beyond what was in my paper. If I were to reach an agreement outside the meeting room, which was beyond the guidance, I needed to go back to Washington and have my guidance amended before I could formally agree on the record. Sounds very bureaucratic, but it's the way nations need to formulate foreign policy. You don't want one person, Dave Scott, formulating foreign policy on the moment. You want an adequate review of position and agreement across government. Development of foreign policy is a complex task that requires examination of unintended consequences. You do not want to be pushing a policy that a nation state at its capital has not agreed to. Trust me, I saw occasions where other nation states had not done due diligence, and they lost confidence of the other nation states. I'd like to talk about a couple things that NATO does outside of Brussels. This is a picture of an aircraft. This is in the United States designed aircraft with very powerful radars and communications equipment known as AWACS. Many of you know two gentlemen here at CLV who were intimately involved in the design of the electronics on board this aircraft. They are George Beck and John Stalin. They were the original designers of this aircraft's capabilities. NATO owns 4 aircraft, and they play a key role in the Middle East in terms of protecting commerce, whether they be other aircraft transiting the region or civilians on the ground. I emphasize peace, and I always will, but NATO does have a rapid response military group. It's ready to respond to conduct defense and peacekeeping activities. NATO, on several occasions, has been asked by the United States to become part of their peacekeeping forces when they couldn't get volunteers from other nations. In several occasions, members of NATO have exchanged their country's military helmets for blue helmets of the United Nations. While we're on this slide of military, I want to address a question. It has been raised in various circles, why does the United States still have military personnel in Europe? The Soviet Union collapsed over 30 years ago. Why do we need troops there today? Today we have less than 30,000 troops in Europe total. This is down from close to 300,000 we had at the height of the Cold War. Today, troops are there for 2 purposes. Not to defend Europe. European forces are doing that. They are there to support U.S. efforts in the Middle East. In my presentation on Germany, I talked about Ramstein Air Force Base. It is a strategic site supporting the Middle East and other parts of the world logistically. We could not operate in many parts of the world without that base. We also use Europe for training. Not training as we did during the Cold War to defend against Russian invasion, but training of troops prior to them going into other locations, primarily the Middle East. As I say, NATO nations have taken on more of the defensive role than many people, politicians and others, give them credit for. Some of you may have been part of the 6th Fleet which patrolled the Mediterranean for over 70 years. Today, those operations are shared with a flotilla of NATO ships, mostly fast frigates and submarines. It is the intent of the United Kingdom in the next few months to begin to deploy 2 new aircraft carriers on a rotational basis. This will free up our aircraft carriers that have been rotating from Norfolk to the Mediterranean. This is a group of migrants trying to reach or get from North Africa to Europe who were rescued by NATO ships. They were the lucky ones. The number of migrants that die trying to cross the Mediterranean is very high. NATO does its best with a lot of conflicting political situations from the various countries in Europe that are affected by this influx of migrants. But its job is to save lives, and it does it as best it can. I mentioned earlier maritime security. You might recall several years ago, merchant ships were being attacked and held for ransom off of the Horn of Africa. That's by Somalia there. We haven't heard much about those incidents lately. Did see a movie a couple of years ago about it. Why haven't we heard about it? The reason is NATO has put a flotilla of ships and aircraft patrolling the area. Yes, NATO is doing the job. Again, they don't get credit. We are increasingly seeing disasters around the world. Man-made disasters, and disasters that are created by global warming and intense storms. Disaster relief is a critical part of NATO's mission, something it does quietly and effectively without a lot of public relations. You may not be aware, but in previous years when particularly we've been hit by hurricanes and considerable damage here in the United States, NATO instantly offered up the help to come with supplies and forces. The United States correctly determined they didn't need the help, but the offer was very much appreciated. Africa. What? NATO is Europe. Why am I putting up a slide about Africa? Because it's about peace. Our bleed, the word bleeds takes the lead in news here in the United States. And sometimes we don't care about what's going on in other parts of the world. But there is a lot of fighting going on in Africa. Terrorism and fighting between various factions. NATO sees that as a major issue that it wants to help resolve. It does not want to resolve it by putting military forces in there. What it has done is engaged with a group called the African Union. All those nations in green are members of the African Union. And they have a commitment to trying to work collectively for peace. And when they do, they don't have what we call logistics support to enable them to do so. So NATO has signed an agreement to provide help with logistics support, primarily air transport support. and intel support. So we're not only working in Europe for peace, we're trying to work in Africa for peace. Is NATO perfect? I dare you to find a perfect organization or any perfect relationship. Security is not about one country defending its borders. Security is a global effort. We all are on this spaceship called Earth, and we need to join together globally to address problems. We may be told otherwise, but I have been on the ground. I have seen the good that NATO can do and believe the United States needs to maintain a leadership role in NATO, and NATO is a good investment. It is in the world's interests, and it is in the United States' interests. Thank you for joining with me today. I want to refer back to where I started. We are celebrating Memorial Day. I have, and many of my colleagues that I've worked with, have tried to celebrate the lives that were sacrificed by working for peace. Today, once again, I would like to say thank you to those that made the ultimate sacrifice. I feel very strongly that their sacrifice would be in vain if we as individuals, as nation states, do not work together to achieve peaceful resolution of conflicts. This has been a little heavier probably than I usually do, but it's something I believe in, it's something I dedicated my life to, and something I thought you should hear. I thank you, have a safe week, and I hope to see you or talk to you next week with another presentation.